Joseph Joe Whitaker stared out over the rolling hills of Blue Heron Ranch, the early morning mist still clinging to the tall grasses. His hands, calloused from decades of hard work, gripped the porch railing as if trying to anchor himself to a world that was slowly slipping away. Today was his 75th birthday, but there would be no grand celebration, no gathering of friends or neighbors. Just a quiet dinner, his 3 children, and the ever-present ghost of the past hanging heavy over the house. Inside, Mrs. Ellen, the long-time housekeeper who had practically raised his children, bustled about setting the table. Her joints ached from arthritis, but her spirit was as stubborn as the land they stood on. "Joe, honey, don't forget Dr. Brent's stopping by this afternoon to check your heart," she called from the kitchen. Joe grunted in reply, his mind already elsewhere. Mark will bring the papers again, he thought grimly. Pushing to sell, saying it's for my own good, for the ranch's good. Mark, his oldest, was a polished attorney from Dallas, always in a suit, even when the heat cracked the earth. Frank, the middle child, had stayed closer to home, working as a veterinarian across the county. And Laura, the baby, the wild spirit, had taken off years ago for New Orleans and rarely looked back. Joe didn't blame them. This ranch was heavy with history, and history had a way of suffocating dreams. The real threat, however, wasn't the dust or debt. It was Colonel Randall Tucker, the local tycoon who had been buying up land all around Blue Heron Ranch. His money, his lawyers, and his promises of progress pressed closer every day. Joe knew what Tucker wanted, the underground gas fields rumored to stretch beneath these hills. He'd die before he sold. He turned and walked inside, the old wooden floor groaning beneath his boots. This land wasn't just soil and stone. It was blood. It was memory. And it wasn't for sale. Caroline Sanders adjusted her sunglasses as she turned off the county highway onto the dirt road leading to Blue Heron Ranch. The truck rattled and bounced, dust swirling behind her like a ghost she couldn't outrun. It had been 10 years since she'd last seen Joe Whitaker. 10 years since she'd left this place behind after everything. Caroline wasn't just anyone from town. She had once been engaged to Mark Whitaker. But tragedy had torn them apart, and she'd rebuilt her life elsewhere, working as a conservation lawyer in Atlanta. Now she was back. Not for Mark, not for old ghosts, for Joe. Mrs. Ellen had called her 3 weeks ago, voice trembling. "Joe's not well, baby. He won't listen to nobody. We need someone he trusts, someone who still loved this land almost as much as he did." Caroline pulled up in front of the old house. The paint had peeled in places, the porch sagged, but the spirit of the place was unbroken. Joe stepped onto the porch, looking thinner but still fierce, the sun carving deeper lines into his face. "Thought you said you weren't ever coming back," he said, his voice gravelly but not unkind. "I lied," Caroline answered simply. He gave a rough chuckle, the closest thing to a welcome she'd get. Inside, Mrs. Ellen hugged her tight, tears brimming. "Thank the Lord you're here." Mark arrived a few hours later, parking his silver SUV like a gleaming alien ship next to Caroline's battered truck. His suit was crisp, his expression cooler than she remembered. "Caroline," he said with a nod. No warmth. "Mark!" Frank showed up next, driving an old blue pickup and bringing with him a black lab named Duke, who bounded out and immediately knocked over a flower pot. "Still raising hell, I see," Caroline laughed. "Wouldn't know how to stop," Frank grinned. Laura was the last to appear, all bright scarves and jangling bracelets, dropping her duffel bag with a theatrical sigh. "Guess I'm here for the funeral early," she quipped. No one laughed. At dinner, Joe said the blessing, his voice trembling just slightly. Then Mark cleared his throat and slid a thick stack of papers across the table toward Joe. "We need to be realistic, Dad. The ranch is bleeding money. Tucker's offering you more than it's worth. You'll be set for life, and so will we." Joe didn't touch the papers. He stared at his son for a long, heavy moment. "This land will be buried with me," he said finally. Mark's jaw tightened. "Don't be stubborn. It's just land. Joe slammed his hand on the table hard enough to rattle the glasses. "It's not just land, it's who we are." Caroline watched the family fracture like old glass. She saw it. Mark's ambition, Joe's pride, Laura's detachment, Frank's silent pain. And she knew. This wasn't just about land. It was about legacy, about choosing what to fight for and what to let go. And Joe Whitaker wasn't letting go without a battle. The days following Joe's birthday fell into a heavy, uneasy rhythm. Caroline stayed on at the ranch, trying to help where she could, balancing checkbooks, fixing leaky pipes, overseeing repairs that Joe refused to admit were needed. Mark, on the other hand, kept pushing. Meetings with appraisers, calls to developers, whispered conversations that stopped when Joe or Caroline entered the room. One afternoon, Caroline caught Frank sitting alone in the barn, stroking Duke's head absently. "Hard to believe we used to run wild through these fields," Frank said, staring out at the dusty horizon. "Now it feels like everything's slipping away." "It doesn't have to," Caroline said softly. "But your father can't fight alone." Frank hesitated. "Mark says we have no choice, that it's just the way things are now." "You believe that?" Frank's jaw clenched. "I believe the ranch won't survive if we all keep pretending everything's fine." Before Caroline could answer, Mrs. Ellen came running across the yard, breathless. "Joe collapsed," she cried. They found him on the floor of the porch, one hand clutching his chest, the other still gripping a stubborn letter from the county tax office. Dr. Brent Collins arrived quickly, his old Ford kicking up dust in the driveway. He examined Joe with a grave face. "His heart's weakening," he said quietly to Caroline. "Stress is killing him. If he doesn't rest, it'll finish the job." Joe, stubborn as ever, waved away talk of hospitals. "This ranch is my blood," he rasped. "I leave it. I die anyway." Caroline sat beside his bed that night, listening to the old boards creak in the wind. She understood him. She understood that losing Blue Heron Ranch wasn't just about land or pride. It was about losing a lifetime. Word spread fast through town. Blue Heron Ranch was in trouble. Offers began coming in, more aggressive than before. Flyers advertising Whitaker land, future site of Tucker Energy Development, appeared on Main Street windows. It wasn't hard to guess who was behind it. Colonel Randall Tucker himself paid a visit one morning, pulling up in a black Lincoln, polished and predatory. He stepped onto the porch like he owned it, hat in hand, silver hair gleaming under the sun. "Joe," he said smoothly, "heard you had a spell." "Mighty sorry to hear it." Joe's mouth tightened into a grim line. "Cut the crap, Randall. You're here to circle the body." Tucker chuckled, unbothered. "Just here to offer a neighborly solution. Sell to me now. I'll make sure you're taken care of. Your kids, too." Caroline stepped forward before Joe could answer. "And if he doesn't?" Tucker's smile cooled. "Would be a shame if all that debt found its way into court. Or if the county started asking hard questions about property taxes unpaid." Joe stood, despite Mrs. Ellen's protests, and faced Tucker squarely. "You can take your threats and shove 'em," he growled. "This land stays in Whitaker hands, as long as I draw breath." Tucker tipped his hat mockingly and left, the dust of his departure settling heavy on the porch. That night, after the house had gone still, Caroline sat in the kitchen with Mark. "You want to save your father's life?" she asked. He raised an eyebrow. "Then stop trying to sell his soul." Mark's jaw tightened, but for the first time she saw something flicker behind his lawyer-perfect facade. Doubt, maybe even guilt. Meanwhile, outside, a shadow moved among the outbuildings. A spark flickered in the darkness. The first barn went up in flames before anyone smelled the smoke. By the time they raced outside, it was too late. The barn, old, beloved, filled with decades of memory, burned like a funeral pyre against the night sky. Joe fell to his knees in the dirt, tears streaming down his weathered face. And Caroline realized something with bone-deep certainty. This wasn't just a battle over land anymore. It was a war for the heart of Blue Heron Ranch. The fire changed everything. By morning, the old barn was nothing but smoldering black skeletons against a gray sky. The air reeked of ash and loss. Joe sat on the front porch, wrapped in a quilt Mrs. Ellen had draped over his shoulders. He hadn't spoken a word since the night before. Frank worked silently beside the ranch hands, salvaging what little they could from the wreckage. Mark was on his phone, talking to insurance agents, county officials, lawyers, none of it amounting to much. Caroline stood by the remains of the barn, fists clenched. It wasn't an accident. She was sure of it, and she knew exactly who was responsible. Colonel Tucker hadn't just sent a message, he'd declared open war. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Hoyt paid a visit, his cruiser crunching up the gravel drive. "Arson's the official word," he told them grimly, "but proving it's another story. No witnesses, no cameras. You folks got enemies?" Joe just glared at him, too tired to answer. Caroline stepped forward. "We do, and you know it." Hoyt sighed, tipping his hat back. "I'll do what I can, but be careful. Folks like Tucker, they don't lose gracefully." As the sheriff drove away, Caroline turned to Mark. "We have to fight this," she said. "We have to go after him legally. Land rights, water rights, environmental protections, anything we can find." Mark shook his head. "You think you're going to beat Tucker in court? He owns half the county." "Then we make it public," she said fiercely. "People won't back a man who burns down barns to steal land." Mark hesitated. For the first time, Caroline saw something crack in his lawyer armor, a glimpse of the boy he used to be, who once dreamed of justice, not just winning. "I'll see what I can dig up," he said quietly. That night, they gathered in the battered kitchen. Joe, Frank, Laura, Caroline, Mrs. Ellen, no more pretending, no more hiding. "This ranch doesn't just belong to me," Joe said, voice rough with smoke and emotion. "It belongs to all of us, and if you want to walk away, I won't hold it against you." He looked each of them in the eye. Laura spoke first, twirling a silver ring on her finger. "I left once. It didn't make me happy. I'm staying." Frank nodded silently, a steady presence as always. Mark, after a long moment, folded his arms and said, "I'm in." Caroline smiled softly. Joe's hands trembled as he reached across the table, laying them on top of each of theirs. "Then we fight," he said. And for the first time in a long time, hope stirred in the heart of Blue Heron Ranch. The next days were a whirlwind. Mark combed through public records, looking for any dirty dealings Tucker might have buried. Caroline drafted legal challenges based on environmental protection laws. Frank coordinated with nearby ranchers, gathering community support. Joe, despite the doctor's warnings, supervised repairs on the house and outbuildings, determined to rebuild with his own two hands. Then came the festival. Every fall, Elmbrook held a harvest festival in the town square, a tradition older than the town charter itself. This year, Caroline convinced Joe they needed to be there to show the community that Blue Heron Ranch wasn't broken. Caroline and Laura set up a booth decorated with photos of the ranch's history, black and white images of cattle drives, harvests, family reunions under the old oak trees. They served Mrs. Ellen's famous apple pies and sweet tea. At first, people kept their distance, wary. The Whitakers had always been respected, but Tucker's influence was heavy, and fear ran deep. Then, one by one, old neighbors came forward. "I remember when Joe's father helped rebuild my barn after the tornado. My granddaddy worked cattle here back in the 60s. My son learned to ride on a Whitaker horse." Stories, memories, loyalty that couldn't be bought or bulldozed. By sunset, the booth was packed. Mark pulled Caroline aside, an unusual light in his eyes. "I found something," he said in a low voice. "Tucker falsified environmental impact reports for the drilling project. If we get this to the right people," Caroline grinned, heart pounding, "we can stop him." But even as they celebrated, a cold knot tightened in Caroline's stomach. She caught sight of Tucker across the festival grounds, standing by his black Lincoln, watching them with a predator's patience. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The news broke like a thunderclap across Elmbrook. An anonymous leak had exposed Colonel Randall Tucker's falsified environmental reports. Local newspapers ran with it. Radio hosts fanned the flames. Even the state environmental agency launched an investigation. For the first time in decades, Tucker was on the defensive. At Blue Heron Ranch, the mood shifted. Hope replaced despair. Pride replaced fear. Joe stood taller, his voice regaining strength as he discussed plans to restore the ranch's cattle program and open part of the land for eco-tourism, projects Caroline had suggested. But Tucker wasn't a man who took defeat quietly. Late one evening, Frank found a warning carved into the side of the main barn. "You were warned." Joe insisted they not call the sheriff, claiming it would make them look weak. But Caroline and Mark tightened security around the ranch, installing cameras and keeping guns within reach. Laura stayed up late in the living room each night, a baseball bat across her knees. They were fighting for their future now. They would not be intimidated. Meanwhile, Caroline and Mark worked tirelessly preparing a case to formally block Tucker's drilling rights. They needed the final push, testimony from someone inside Tucker's operations. They needed a whistleblower. One night, Frank showed up at Caroline's door, grim-faced. "I might know someone," he said. "One of the ranch hands Tucker hired for preliminary work. Kid named Ethan. Didn't like what he saw." Caroline's heart raced. "If he's willing to talk, we can bury Tucker for good." They arranged to meet Ethan in secret, under the cover of darkness, at the abandoned church on the edge of town. Caroline, Mark, and Frank waited inside, the old pews creaking under their weight, the air thick with dust and tension. Finally, footsteps echoed outside. Ethan stepped in, a thin, wiry young man with nervous eyes. "I don't have much time," he said. "They're watching everybody." He handed over a flash drive. Emails, blueprints, photos, everything. As Caroline reached for it, headlights flashed outside, tires squealed, shots cracked through the night. Frank tackled Ethan to the ground just as a bullet shattered one of the stained glass windows. Mark dragged Caroline behind the altar. "Stay down," he hissed. Another shot rang out, embedding itself into the wooden pew where Caroline had been sitting seconds before. Frank pulled his revolver from his belt and returned fire. 2 quick controlled shots into the night. The headlights jerked and the truck roared off down the gravel road. For a moment, the world was eerily silent again, broken only by the sound of everyone's ragged breathing. Ethan pushed himself up, shaking. "I told you," he rasped. "They don't play fair." Caroline helped him to his feet. "We have enough now," she said. "We can end this." By morning, Mark had uploaded the contents of the flash drive to every major news outlet in the state. Evidence of bribery, environmental violations, threats to landowners. By afternoon, state troopers raided Tucker's offices. And by nightfall, Randall Tucker was arrested on charges that would keep him tied up in courtrooms, and most likely prison cells, for years to come. At Blue Heron Ranch, the family gathered under the ancient oak tree. Joe stood in the fading light, tears glistening in his eyes as he looked at the land stretching out before him, untouched, unbroken, still theirs. "You saved it," he said quietly. "No, Daddy," Laura said, wrapping her arm around his shoulders. "You saved us. You taught us what was worth fighting for." Joe looked at each of them, Frank, Laura, Mark, Caroline, and smiled. For the first time in years, it wasn't a smile weighed down by loss. It was a smile full of pride and peace. They had won, but more importantly, they had found each other again. As the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky turned deep gold, Caroline felt it settle inside her like a promise. Home wasn't just a place. Home was a choice, and she was choosing it, choosing them, every single day. Fall settled over Elmbrook in a blaze of gold and crimson. The air turned crisp, the nights longer, and Blue Heron Ranch thrived like it hadn't in years. The cattle were healthy, the land was healing, and people from neighboring counties started visiting for the Whitaker farm tours and harvest markets that Caroline and Laura had launched. Joe walked the fields every morning now, Duke trailing faithfully at his heels. His steps were slower, but his spirit was lighter. The land fed him, even as his body tired. One afternoon, Caroline found Joe sitting beneath the massive oak tree, an old leather journal open in his lap. He looked up and smiled when he saw her. "You ever wonder why I fought so hard for this place?" he asked. She sat beside him on the worn bench, pulling her jacket tighter against the breeze. "Because it's home," she said simply. Joe nodded, running a calloused hand over the rough wood of the bench. "My father died under this tree," he said. "Right here. Heart attack. Never even saw it coming. He died with his boots on, looking over the land he loved." He closed the journal, eyes misty but clear. "I want the same." Caroline swallowed hard. "You've still got time, Joe. Years." He chuckled softly. "We don't get to choose how much time we have, only what we do with it." He handed her the journal. "I've written it all down. The history, the mistakes, the love. It's yours now, all of it." She took it, the weight of it anchoring her heart. "I'll take care of it," she whispered. "I know," he said, patting her hand. "That's why it's yours." The sun slipped lower behind the hills, bathing everything in warm, golden light. And for the first time, Caroline truly understood. Blue Heron Ranch wasn't just soil and cattle and fences. It was memory, it was sacrifice, it was family. Winter came in quietly that year. Joe passed away in his sleep 2 days before Christmas, in the house he'd been born in, surrounded by his children and the woman he had trusted with his legacy. The funeral was held under the old oak tree, just like he had wanted. No church pomp, no heavy rituals, just family, friends, and the open sky. Mark delivered the eulogy, voice cracking as he talked about his father's stubbornness, his pride, and above all, his heart. Frank sang a hymn, his voice low and steady, the sound carrying over the hills. Laura read a poem Joe had once written in a worn notebook, words about land and blood, hope and forgiveness. Caroline stood last, holding the old leather journal tight against her chest. She didn't speak long. "Joe Whitaker taught me that home isn't where you're born, it's where you choose to stand, where you choose to love." She looked out at the crowd, at neighbors, ranchers, friends, and knew Joe had left his mark on every single one of them. After the service, they all walked together to the family cemetery behind the ranch house where generations of Whitakers rested. They laid him to rest beneath the oak where the roots ran deep and strong. Spring would come again, the land would bloom, and his legacy would live, not in buildings or money, but in the lives he had shaped, in the land he had fought for, and in the family he had left stronger than he had found it. As Caroline stood beneath the bare branches, snow beginning to fall around her, she made a silent promise. She would protect this place, she would honor his memory, and she would never, ever forget. Blue Heron Ranch wasn't just saved, it was reborn.